Part 1. The Perfect Vacation. The champagne flutes clinked lightly, their crisp ring disappearing into the warm, salty breeze. Ethan and Olivia sat on a private terrace overlooking the endless turquoise ocean, the last traces of daylight melting into a deep orange glow. Their resort in the Maldives was the kind of paradise people dreamed about: pristine beaches, luxurious villas, and an air of exclusivity that separated them from the rest of the world. To an outsider, they looked like the perfect couple, but Olivia knew better. She traced the rim of her glass with a manicured finger, stealing a glance at Ethan. His jaw was tight, his eyes glued to the phone in his hand, the flickering screen casting a faint glow on his face. He hadn't even looked at her in the past 10 minutes. "You said no work this week," Olivia murmured, swirling the wine in her glass. Ethan barely glanced up, his hazel eyes clouded with distraction. "Just a few emails." "It's nothing," she sighed, placing her glass down on the table a little harder than necessary. "It's never nothing, Ethan. This is our honeymoon all over again." At that, he finally looked at her, his brow creasing. "That's not fair, isn't it? You promised me no work, no calls, just us. But you've been glued to your phone since we landed." Ethan exhaled sharply and set the device down, rubbing his temples. "I run a firm, Olivia. I can't just disappear for a week." "I'm not asking you to disappear," she said, voice quieter now. "I'm asking you to be present." For a moment, he said nothing. The distant sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the silence between them. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, reaching for her hand. "I'm here," he said, squeezing her fingers. "I know I've been distracted. I'll do better. Let's not waste this trip fighting." She searched his face for sincerity. He always had a way of saying just enough to make her doubt her anger, to make her wonder if she was overreacting. "Okay," she said finally. They finished dinner in relative peace, though Olivia still felt the distance between them. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, that their marriage had turned into something mechanical: polite smiles, hollow reassurances, and a growing space between them that neither was willing to address. Back in their villa, Olivia changed into a silk nightgown, brushing her hair absent-mindedly as she watched Ethan settle into bed. He was already reaching for his phone again, fingers tapping out messages she didn't care to ask about. She hesitated. "Ethan?" He hummed in response, eyes never leaving the screen. "Do you think we're happy?" That got his attention. He put the phone down and looked at her, brow furrowed. "What kind of question is that?" I don't know. We don't talk like we used to." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Liv, we're fine. Not every marriage is fireworks and romance every second of the day." "I know that." She bit her lip. "But it feels like I'm alone, even when I'm with you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I can't have this conversation again." "Why not?" she pressed, voice shaking slightly. "Is it because you know I'm right?" His expression hardened. "I love you, Olivia, but I have a job that demands my attention. That doesn't mean I love you any less." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let it go. But something inside her was screaming, this isn't enough anymore. After a tense silence, Ethan sighed. "Let's not ruin our vacation, okay? Can we just go to sleep?" She nodded, though she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. Ethan turned off the light, and within minutes, his breathing evened out. Olivia lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of loneliness settle over her. Then, she heard it. Faint music, drifting in from the beach. Her eyes flickered to the glass doors leading to the terrace. Outside, a small bar on the shoreline was still open, its lanterns swaying gently in the wind. She saw the faint silhouettes of people laughing, drinking, enjoying the night. Maybe a drink would help. Maybe she just needed fresh air. Careful not to wake Ethan, she slipped out of bed, grabbed a silk cover-up, and stepped out into the warm night air. The sand was soft beneath her feet as she made her way toward the bar, following the music like a siren's call. She had no idea that this night would change everything. Part 2. Flirting with a stranger. The beachside bar was alive with a quiet, seductive energy. Soft lanterns cast flickering golden light across the sand, and the mellow strumming of a guitar blended with the rhythmic crash of the waves. Olivia hesitated just outside the wooden deck, feeling the pulse of the music vibrate beneath her bare feet. She knew she shouldn't be here. She should be back in bed with Ethan, wrapped in the familiar comfort of their routine. But that's all it was now, a routine. Nothing more. She stepped forward. The bartender, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, greeted her with a nod. Late night? Olivia offered a small smile. Something like that. She slid onto a stool, the cool wood smooth against her legs. I'll have a mojito. The bartender got to work, and as Olivia glanced around, her gaze landed on a man seated a few stools down. He was alone, swirling a dark amber liquid in his glass, his sun-kissed skin glowing under the warm light. His hair was dark and slightly tousled, and when he turned, their eyes met. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. "You don't look like someone who should be drinking alone," he said, his voice smooth, rich, like someone who knew exactly the kind of effect he had on people. Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. "Neither do you." The man chuckled, shifting in his seat to face her fully. "Touché." He raised his glass in a silent toast before taking a sip. "I'm Daniel." "Olivia." "Olivia." He repeated her name like he was tasting it. "Here alone?" She hesitated. The truth was simple. No, she wasn't alone. She was married. But the weight of that word felt heavier than usual tonight. "My husband is sleeping," she finally said. Daniel arched a brow. "And you're not." She gave him a small, rueful smile. "I guess I just needed some air." The bartender slid her drink across the counter, and Olivia took a sip, letting the cool mint and lime settle her nerves. Daniel tilted his head. "Rough night?" "You could say that." He didn't pry, just watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You know," he mused, swirling the ice in his drink, "most people would kill to be at a place like this with the person they love." Olivia let out a short laugh, more bitter than amused. "And what makes you think I'm not?" Daniel studied her for a long moment. "Because happy people don't sneak out to drink alone at midnight." His words struck deeper than she expected. She didn't respond right away, just stared at the ocean beyond the bar. A couple walked hand in hand along the shore, their laughter carried by the wind. She used to have that with Ethan, genuine, effortless happiness. Daniel's voice pulled her back. "I'm guessing it's not just about tonight." Olivia met his gaze. "You ask a lot of questions." He smirked. "Only when I'm interested." There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at her. Not just with interest, but with appreciation, curiosity. Like she was someone worth figuring out. Ethan hadn't looked at her like that in a long time. She took another sip of her drink, feeling the warmth of the alcohol settle in her stomach. Daniel leaned in slightly. "Dance with me." She blinked. "What?" He nodded toward the small, open space where a few couples swayed to the slow, sultry melody playing from the speakers. "Come on. One dance." Olivia hesitated. She should say no. She should finish her drink, go back to the villa, slip into bed beside Ethan, and pretend this night never happened. But instead, she found herself setting down her glass and slipping off her stool. Daniel grinned, taking her hand and leading her to the dance floor. His palm was warm against hers, his touch easy, like they'd done this before. He pulled her close, his arm resting lightly on her waist, and she let herself melt into the rhythm. The music was slow, sensual, the kind of song that made you want to close your eyes and forget everything else. Olivia felt the weight of Daniel's hand against her back, the way his fingers traced small circles just above her hip. Her heart pounded. "This okay?" he murmured. She should step back. She should remind him that she was married. Instead, she whispered, "Yes." His grip tightened just a fraction, pulling her closer. She let out a slow breath, her body reacting to the warmth of his touch, the deep timbre of his voice. It had been so long since she felt like this, wanted, seen, desired. She felt his breath against her ear as he leaned in. "You're beautiful, Olivia." A shiver ran through her. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for her lips to hover near his jaw. It would be so easy to close the gap, to let herself get lost in the moment. But then, A loud crash echoed from the shoreline. A woman's scream cut through the night. Olivia jerked back, her pulse skyrocketing. She turned just in time to see a group of people running toward the water, their panicked voices rising over the music. "What the hell?" Daniel muttered, already moving toward the commotion. Olivia followed, her feet sinking into the sand as they approached the shoreline. The once serene beach was now a scene of chaos. A body lay half submerged in the water. A woman, her blonde hair fanned out like seaweed, her dress clinging to her limp form. A man was already kneeling beside her, pressing his fingers desperately to her neck. "She's not breathing." Someone else shouted, "Call security. Get help." Olivia's stomach lurched. It wasn't just any woman. It was one of the other guests at the resort. She had seen her earlier that day, lounging by the pool with her husband. And now, she was dead. Daniel turned to Olivia, his expression dark. "Do you know her?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "I think she was staying in the villa next to mine." A cold wave of dread washed over her. This wasn't just some tragic accident. Because as the lights from the bar illuminated the woman's pale face, Olivia saw something chilling. A thin, angry red mark wrapped around her throat, like someone had strangled her. The music stopped. The laughter was gone. And suddenly, Olivia wasn't just a woman dancing with a stranger. She was a witness. And maybe, just maybe, the next target. Part 3. An intimate moment at night. The villa was still and silent when Olivia slipped inside, shutting the door carefully behind her. The air conditioning cooled the sweat on her skin, but she still felt feverish, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She had almost kissed him. She had wanted to. The thought sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over her. But the worst part, the part she couldn't shake, was the way she had felt in that moment. Alive, desired, seen. If it hadn't been for the scream that shattered the night, she didn't know what would have happened. She took a slow breath, turning toward the bed. Ethan lay on his side, his back to her, the dim glow of his phone flickering against the sheets. His breathing was steady, deep, the same as always. He hadn't even noticed she was gone. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Slipping off her sandals, Olivia padded toward the bathroom and locked the door behind her. The moment she turned on the faucet, she splashed cold water onto her face, gripping the counter as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were wide, lips still slightly parted, her hair tousled from the wind. She looked different. Not like a wife who had been desperately trying to save her marriage. Not like someone who had spent the past 2 days in a living nightmare, watching body wash up on shore. No, she looked like someone who had just wanted something she wasn't supposed to have. A shiver crawled up her spine. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't be this person. With a deep breath, she turned off the sink and stepped back into the bedroom. She had barely taken 2 steps when, "Where were you?" Olivia froze. Ethan was awake. His voice was quiet, his posture unchanged, but she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing into her. Her fingers curled at her sides. "What?" Ethan shifted onto his back, staring at the ceiling. "You weren't here." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Olivia swallowed hard. "I just needed some air." Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his phone down on the nightstand. "At 2 in the morning? I couldn't sleep." She hated how weak her voice sounded, how defensive. A long pause. Then Ethan said, "You weren't alone." Her stomach twisted violently. He knew. Her pulse pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What are you talking about?" Ethan finally turned his head, locking eyes with her. He was studying her, like he was trying to see through her. "I saw you," he said simply. Her heart nearly stopped. Ethan sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His movements were slow, deliberate. "I watched you leave. I watched you go to the beach." Olivia felt lightheaded, the room suddenly too small. She opened her mouth, searching for an explanation, but Ethan beat her to it. "Tell me something," he murmured, tilting his head. "Did you even think about me? While you were with him?" She sucked in a sharp breath. The words knocked the air from her lungs. She couldn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. Ethan smiled, but it wasn't his usual smile. It was something colder. darker, something that made her entire body go still. Then, just as quickly, he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "Go to bed, Olivia." And just like that, the conversation was over. Or at least, that's what Ethan wanted her to think. But as Olivia climbed into bed, her heart hammering, she knew one thing for certain. Her husband wasn't asleep when she left. He was awake. He had been watching her the whole time. Part 4. A mysterious disappearance. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Ethan's face was cast in shadows, his eyes locked on hers, his phone glowing faintly in his hands. He had seen the message. He knew. Her entire body went cold. "Who's Daniel?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Too quiet. Olivia swallowed, her fingers tightening around the door handle. She had to stay calm. She had to think. "He's just someone I met at the bar," she said carefully. "We were talking about—" "Don't lie to me, Olivia." Ethan's voice was still calm, but something about it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She hesitated. Ethan stood up. Olivia instinctively took a step back, pressing herself against the door. His gaze was unreadable, cold. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You were going to meet him," he murmured, "in the middle of the night, while I was asleep." Her pulse pounded so hard she thought she might pass out. He took a slow step toward her. "Are you sleeping with him?" "No," she said quickly. "No, Ethan reached out, brushing his fingers along her wrist. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down her spine. "I know you're lying," he whispered. A shiver ran through her. For the first time in their marriage, Olivia was afraid of him. She had never seen him like this before. This version of Ethan was careful, calculated, dangerous. She forced herself to breathe. "You have to get out of here." She forced a small, shaky laugh. "Ethan, please. You're overreacting." He stared at her for another moment before finally stepping back. "Go back to bed, Olivia." Her knees nearly buckled with relief. She turned slowly, moving toward the bed, slipping under the covers. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket over herself. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed, his back to her. He was still holding his phone, still staring at the message. After a long, agonizing moment, he locked the screen and placed it on the nightstand. Then, as if nothing had happened, he lay down beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't say another word. But Olivia knew he was still awake, watching, thinking. And for the first time since she had married him, she realized something terrifying. She didn't know her husband at all. The next morning, Olivia barely slept. By the time the sun rose, she felt like a ghost. Ethan was already up, standing by the window, sipping his coffee. He turned when he heard her stir. "Morning." She forced herself to sit up, rubbing her eyes. "Morning." He studied her for a long moment. "Didn't sleep well?" "No." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Neither did I." Her stomach twisted. Ethan set his coffee down and grabbed his phone. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we should spend the day together." She swallowed hard. "Oh." He nodded. "Just us. No distractions." There was something pointed about the way he said it. Before she could answer, a knock at the door made them both freeze. Ethan's gaze flickered toward her before he strode over and opened it. A security officer stood outside. His uniform was slightly damp with sweat, his expression unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" "Yes," Ethan said smoothly. "We need to ask you a few questions." Olivia's throat went dry. "What about?" Ethan asked. The officer shifted slightly. "One of our guests, Jennifer Maddox, has disappeared." Olivia's blood turned to ice. Jennifer, the woman from the lobby, the one who had warned her to be careful. She was gone. Ethan's face was unreadable. "That's terrible. When did she go missing?" The officer pulled out a notepad. "Her husband reported her missing this morning. She never came back to their villa last night." Olivia's heart pounded. That meant Jennifer had vanished the same night Daniel had asked her to meet him, the same night Ethan had stopped her from leaving, the same night he had been awake. The officer turned to Olivia. "Mrs. Carter, did you happen to see Jennifer last night?" Her mouth was too dry to speak. Ethan placed a hand on her back, rubbing small circles. To anyone watching, it would seem comforting. To Olivia, it felt like a warning. She was in the lobby yesterday, Olivia finally said, forcing the words out. She was upset about her friend who went missing. The officer nodded, scribbling something down. And last night? No, she whispered. Ethan's hand lingered on her back. The officer glanced between them. If you think of anything, let us know. Ethan smiled. Of course. The moment the officer left, Olivia stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. She's gone, she murmured. Ethan nodded, taking another sip of coffee. Seems that way. Olivia turned to him. Don't you care? He raised an eyebrow. Of course I care. But there was no emotion in his voice. No concern. Nothing. Her hands trembled. Ethan, where were you last night? His lips curved into a slow, careful smile. Where do you think I was? Olivia took a shaky step back. Ethan watched her, amused. Then, he grabbed his phone, tapping something on the screen. A moment later, he turned it toward her. Her stomach dropped. It was a picture of her, asleep, taken from the side of the bed. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through her. I was right here, Ethan murmured, watching over you. Olivia felt her breath shatter in her chest. She hadn't heard him take a picture. She hadn't felt him move. She had no idea how long he had been awake. Watching, waiting. Ethan stood up, stretching. Come on, he said. Let's enjoy the day, like we planned. Olivia couldn't move. The man standing in front of her, the man she had married, lived with, loved, was a stranger. And worse than that, she wasn't sure if she would make it off this island alive. Part 5. The Final Escape. Olivia sat on the terrace, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The resort was eerily quiet. Jennifer was gone. Another woman vanished without a trace. And Ethan wasn't acting like a man who was concerned. He was sitting across from her, stirring his drink with a slow, methodical motion, his expression unreadable. He hadn't mentioned last night again, hadn't mentioned catching her trying to leave, hadn't mentioned Daniel, and that terrified her even more. Because Ethan wasn't the type to let things go. He was the type to wait, to plan, to strike when she least expected it. Olivia swallowed hard. She needed to get out of here. She needed to find Daniel. Before Ethan stopped her again. Midnight. Olivia lay in bed, wide awake, her body tense beneath the covers. Ethan was beside her, still, silent, but she knew he wasn't asleep. She could feel it. The weight of his presence pressed against her like a phantom touch, suffocating and inescapable. She had to be careful. She had to be smarter this time. Slowly, carefully, she shifted, feigning sleep as she turned onto her side. Ethan didn't move, didn't react. She counted the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3. Then, she waited until his breathing evened out, until the rhythm of his chest rising and falling became so steady, so normal, that she almost believed it. Almost. Now, moving as silently as possible, Olivia slid out from under the sheets, barely daring to breathe as she placed one foot on the floor. Then another. Still, Ethan didn't move. Her heart hammered as she tiptoed toward the door. She didn't dare grab her phone. She didn't dare risk it. Instead, she reached for the handle and froze. The door was locked. From the inside, her stomach dropped. She turned, heart racing, her gaze snapping back toward the bed. Ethan was awake, sitting up, watching her, waiting. A slow, knowing smile stretched across his lips. Going somewhere? Olivia's blood turned to ice. The confrontation. She couldn't move. Ethan sat in bed, one arm draped casually over the sheets, his head tilted slightly as he watched her. He looked amused, like a predator toying with its prey. Olivia's mouth was dry. Ethan stood up. The movement was slow, controlled, deliberate. Let me guess, he murmured, stepping closer. You just needed some air? She backed away. Her heel hit the door. There was nowhere to go. Ethan. He stopped inches from her, his hand pressing flat against the door beside her head. His body boxed her in, his presence overwhelming. You lied to me, Olivia. Her breath hitched. Shoo. His finger brushed against her lips, silencing her. She flinched. Ethan's eyes darkened. Then, in one swift movement, he reached behind her and unlocked the door. Olivia's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Had expected him to stop her, to trap her. But instead, he took a step back, then another. And with that same cold, unreadable smile, he said, "Go ahead." Her stomach twisted. "What?" Ethan gestured toward the door. "You want to leave so badly? Then leave." Every instinct in her body screamed at her not to move. It was a trick, a game. He wanted her to run, wanted her to prove him right. Her hands trembled. Her feet wouldn't move. Ethan let out a soft laugh. "That's what I thought." He turned away, walking toward the bathroom. "Go to bed, Olivia." And just like that, the conversation was over. The final escape. She didn't sleep. As soon as the first hint of daylight bled through the curtains, she slipped out of bed and ran. Not to Ethan. Not to the security office. To Daniel. She found him at the bar, nursing a drink far too early in the morning. The moment he saw her, he frowned. "Olivia?" She grabbed his wrist. "We need to talk." Daniel's brows furrowed. "Are you okay?" No, she wasn't. She didn't know if she ever would be again. But she didn't answer. She just pulled him toward the beach, away from prying eyes, away from Ethan. "We leave tonight." Daniel hesitated but nodded. "I'll get everything ready." That night, Olivia packed only the essentials. No phone, no unnecessary weight. Just the cash Daniel had given her and her passport. They had arranged a boat to take them off the island before sunrise. She took one last glance at Ethan, sleeping peacefully in their bed. Or at least, appearing to. She didn't know if he was truly asleep or waiting for her to make her move. But she couldn't hesitate. With her heart pounding, she crept to the door, her fingers barely making a sound as she turned the knob. Unlocked. She swallowed hard. Then, she stepped outside. The warm night air wrapped around her as she moved swiftly across the sand toward the dock. Daniel was waiting. The boat rocked gently against the wooden planks. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She nodded. But just as they were about to board, a voice sliced through the darkness. "Going somewhere?" Olivia's breath stopped. She turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. Ethan stood at the end of the dock, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I figured you'd try to run," he said, stepping forward. "But you should know something, Olivia." She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll never really escape me." The last thing Olivia saw was the glint of something metallic in his hand before everything went black. The end.